Hello, welcome to another David Messiah YouTube channel presentation. Here our watchwords are to teach and to build back up the kingdom of Zion. And my name is Sidney Thomas. I'm the founder and the moderator of this channel. Welcome. The title of this particular talk is the etymological definitions and interrelations of Zohar, Zion, Armageddon, Negro and Nega. The etymological definitions and interrelations of Zohar, Zion, Armageddon, Negro and Nega. And these are all interrelated, as we have been sort of making clear in the past several video presentations. But this particular presentation is based on an audio lecture that I presented since January past and shared with beloved brother Big Levi and Abdullah Seir, when Brother Abdullah was talking about Zohar. So you would have in previous presentations already been given the definitions etymologically of nega and negro, where those words came from, because they are Hebrew words. Armageddon, which in the Paleo Hebrew, the core of that word is actually har amagededi, which is another way of referencing the Negro. And the Negro comes out of Nega David, where Nega is a Hebrew word, he who is watched over by the Most High, that has come to mean king and is associated, at least originally, with King David. And then in talking about Zion, we find that Zion and Zohar are certainly interrelated etymologically and in terms of their basic construct. So the end purpose really was to try to get a handle on the concept of Zohar. But in this particular audio presentation, going back to January, all I tried to do was to give an etymological definition of Zohar and relate it to the issue of Zion and the concept of Zion, and to relate both really to what was the subject of the previous presentation, which is the idea and the subject of Kabbalah, because Zohar arises in particular in that context, in the context of Kabbalah and the tree of life. But again, in this particular audio presentation, I go only to the etymological definition and for the insight that provides. I hope to do a sort of a follow-up to this presentation on Zohar specifically, and exploring again that interconnection that it has with the concept and practice also of Kabbalah, and also to tie it in with one of the subjects of the previous presentation, in which the link is made between Kabbalah and the ancient schools of the Negro prophets, where we in the last presentation we found that the word that was used for priest in that context was Teshog, so that people like Merlin the magician was a Teshog. He was also called a druid, but druid, like Armageddon, is just another way of saying Negroes. The referent is the people of Nega David. So druid was not a word for priest, druid was a word for Negro. But because we associate the druids with their sort of priestly sort of capabilities, such as displayed by Merlin the magician, such as has come down to us in the form, for example, of Stonehenge in England, which we of course ascribe to the Druidic priests. It is interesting to mention that the proper name for those people were Teshogim in the plural. And they were separate and distinct and set apart from the Aaronic priests. The Aaronic priests took care of the temples, or rather the temple, singular, took care of the sacrifices, the daily sacrifices, and so forth, and were the ones who were the expert in the law, in Torah per se, and were supposed to teach the people the law. Well, that kind of a priest was different from the Teshog. The Aaronic priests all were of the tribe of Levi. That was their role and function, and all were descended from Aaron. The Teshogim, on the other hand, were spread across all the tribes, all the 12 tribes of Israel. So that when the northern tribes were scattered out of the land, and some of them ended up in Western Europe and became their practitioners of what is the true word etymologically for what today we call Kabbalah, which is Gawalat. They gave that word Gawalat ended up as the sort of root etymologically of what they call themselves, how that has come down to us as Gauls and also as Celts, because they were practitioners of Gawalat. So they were Teshogim, priests in that sense, Kabbalists if you prefer. And it is that practice of Gawalat that is what now has come down to us in every Negro cultural retention that is of that order, that sort. So whether it is voodoo in Haiti, or whether it is the Shouter or spiritual or Shango Baptist here in Trinidad, or whether it is the retentions of the Yoruba people still in Yoruba land, wherever you go, where our people are, whether of the northern tribes, whether of the southern tribes, whether of Levi or otherwise, we had the practices of Gawalat, of the Teshogim, and by different names. Yeah, man. So this purpose of this particular presentation is now to kind of give the grand overview that I was talking about briefly in the previous presentation, that tries to connect the intellectual kind of conceptual frame for this kind of practice with the spiritual traditions that have come down to us in a very practical kind of a way. So one can do the practice of it without having very clear understanding, or any understanding at all really, of the intellectual conceptual frame. But as I mentioned on the last video presentation, as Zion is returned, it is necessary to reach back to greater illumination in these matters, and to reacquire, because it is what has been lost, to reacquire that understanding from those days gone back. Now, in terms of the particular audio presentation, to which I give a link in the description box, and addressing, everything from the word Nega to the word Zohar, some of this is now old hat, as I mentioned. But nevertheless, because it was the first sort of, elucidation of the origins of these words, in particular Nega, Negro, Armageddon, and so forth, in a sense, they're the best. Because although I have talked about these things in other presentations, it was always on the way to doing something else. So in those cases, the presentation was fairly sketchy. So, but with this particular audio lecture, I would say this is the best for going back to the etymological roots of those core words that really are at the base even of the concepts of Zion, to which we are returning. The core concept of the war of Armageddon, which is a war against the rise of the Negro people, and the concept of Zohar, which is tied to the concept of Zion because they're etymological sort of cousins, so to say. Zion literally means the first letter, Hebrew letter there is Zadi, which is depicted by a trail. So the idea is of being on a trail, and when you come to the end of the trail, you get to that second pictograph, which is Nun, corresponds to English letter N, which represents the son as of the father. And so at the end of the trail, the son. So this is an allusion to the son of David and to a continuation of the Zion project that he started, which was interrupted by the four kingdoms of the Gentiles. And Zohar, likewise, the first letter there is also Zadi, which is depicted by that trail. Second letter is He, which is depicted by a man with outstretched arms, and is also depicted by a pictograph that sort of suggests the breath. And then the final letter is the letter Resh, depicted by a head. So Zohar, the picture being drawn is of you go along a trail, and then at some point, you know, as depicted by that letter He, you have the idea of behold. It's like you see something and you raise your hands in almost prayer or at least astonishment. The king, which is depicted by that letter Resh. But that king is none other than the son of David. So it is again a way of referring to Zion. But in addition, there's an irony in the word itself, because it's like you start at the head of a trail, but then at the end of the trail, you would again say, now the head. So that last letter there, Resh, means the king, but it also can mean simply head in a more abstract sense. So if you start at the head of something and you go along a long trail and then you come back to that head, where are you? You're back exactly where you started, with perhaps a suggestion now to go inward. And this is part of the idea of Zohar. I do not say it is all of it, because it is that, and it is also the other idea of the restoration of Zion and what now comes with it, which in a sense is the practice of Gawalat, which is what our forefathers of the northern tribes, when they were scattered out because they were not following the law of the Most High. And they made that pact, commitment amongst themselves, and when they did get to the promised land, that's what they would do. So they also had the idea of a Zion project. And this was what Merlin and these other people, practitioners of Gawalat, now today called Kabbalah, that is what they were about. But it was a sort of a project that did not quite succeed, despite the good intentions. And we saw that too in the Book of Mormon. They made the same kind of pact and commitment. But by and by, over time, there was a sort of a decay and a lack of commitment, which sometimes comes along with prosperity. Once things are going good, you tend to forget the Most High and the commitments that you might have made to Him. So this is some of what happened. I wouldn't say it is all of what happened. But nevertheless, the Zion project conceptually remains as an ideal to which we should we should return, and certainly we are now at that stage in sort of prophesied history at the very start of the seventh millennium, when we are set to have a millennium of peace, of justice, of righteousness, a return, in effect, to the Zion project, and with that also a return, proper return to the practice of Gawalat, and a proper practice and understanding of what this idea is of Zohar. So, but in this particular talk, I give only the etymological understanding of it. I plan, if the Most High is willing, to do a follow-up to this one, in which I address the idea of Zohar, and of all these other ideas which are interrelated with the idea of Zohar, in particular the idea of Kabbalah or Gawalat, and to address it from that angle, trying to marry the intellectual, sort of conceptual understanding of the whole subject with the particular practices, spiritual practices, which have certainly been retained by such as the Shango Baptists and Shouter Baptists of Trinidad, certainly been retained by the voodoo practitioners, priests of Haiti, and in every community where the Negro has been scattered, whether it is Brazil with the, was it Candomblé, whether it is the Congo with their particular practices, or wherever. South Africa, I know the Zulu certainly have their practices, and all of them share a kind of a similarity, all of which ultimately had that origin in the schools of the ancient Negro prophets who were there at the beginning of the Zion project and who will now have again to be sort of reconstituted and perhaps elevated a little bit, purified a little bit, sharpened up a little bit as Zion, as the Zion project returns. So with that, I commend this presentation to you for what it is worth. All praises to the Most High, all glory, all exaltation, all thanks whatsoever be unto him. And to all of you listening, shalom.